The envelope hit the table so hard the coffee cups rattled. Your father's debt, $12 million. Dante Moretti didn't raise his voice. He never had to. You have 72 hours to settle it, or I take everything. The apartment, the car, and you. Amelia Russo stared at the man she had worked beside for 5 years, the man she thought she knew. There is a second option. He slid a single sheet of paper across the mahogany surface. A contract. Her name already printed at the bottom. Become my wife. The debt disappears. You walk away with your life intact. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs so he wouldn't see. This is the moment everything changes, and you won't want to miss a single second of what happens next. If this story already has you gripped, subscribe to our channel so you never miss what's coming. Hit that like button and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. She had been his secretary for 5 years, 3 months, and 11 days. Amelia Russo knew that number the way she knew her own heartbeat, not because she was counting down to something, but because the job had become her entire life without her ever planning for it to. She knew the exact temperature Dante Moretti liked his espresso. She knew which suppliers he trusted and which ones he smiled at while privately despising. She knew when the tension in his shoulders meant a deal had gone bad, and when the silence in his office meant someone, somewhere, was about to regret crossing him. What she didn't know, what she had told herself firmly and repeatedly over 5 years, was anything personal about the man. That was the rule. Her rule. Not his. Dante had never given her rules about personal distance. He didn't need to. The way he occupied a room made the boundaries clear without a single word spoken. People didn't get close to Dante Moretti. People performed their functions and stepped back and were grateful he hadn't noticed them in the wrong way. Amelia had been good at that. She had been almost perfect at it. Until the morning she got the call about her father. She was at her desk when her cell phone buzzed, an unknown number, and something cold moved through her chest before she even answered. She had learned to trust that feeling over 32 years of life. It had never been wrong. Miss Russo? The voice was clinical, hospital smooth. This is Mercy General. I'm calling about a Vincent Russo. She was out the door in 4 minutes. She didn't even tell anyone she was leaving. She just grabbed her bag and walked, and the whole elevator ride down she kept pressing her thumbnail into the inside of her wrist because the pain kept her thinking clearly, and she needed to think clearly. Her father was already gone when she arrived. The doctor used words like sudden cardiac event and did everything we could, but Amelia stopped hearing around the 3rd sentence. She sat in a plastic chair in a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and old coffee, and she looked at her hands in her lap, and she thought, he was 61 years old. He was supposed to have more time. She stayed there for 2 hours. A nurse brought her water she didn't drink. Then she went home and started going through her father's papers. That was how she found the first letter. It was tucked inside the back cover of an old ledger, the kind her father used to keep for his dry cleaning business before he'd sold it 8 years ago. The letter was dated 14 months back. The letterhead was simple, black ink on white paper. No logo, no decorative border, just a name at the top. Moretti Holdings. Her stomach turned over. She read it twice. Then a 3rd time, slower, her finger moving under each line. Her father had borrowed money. Not from a bank. Not from a normal lender. He had walked into the offices of Moretti Holdings. She didn't know when, she didn't know why, she didn't know how he had even made that connection. And he had borrowed an amount that made her physically press her hand over her mouth. $12 million. And this letter, polite in its language and absolutely terrifying in its precision, was a reminder that the repayment schedule had been missed. 3 consecutive payments. The letter outlined in calm and measured terms what would happen next if arrangements were not made. Amelia set the letter down on the kitchen table. She sat there for a very long time. Then she picked up her phone and called her father's oldest friend, a man named Gerald, who had known Vincent Russo for 40 years and who picked up on the second ring with the particular wariness of a man who had been waiting for bad news. Gerald. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it. Did you know about the money my father borrowed from Moretti? The pause on the other end told her everything. Amelia, how much did you know? He made me promise not to. Gerald. She said his name like a door closing. Tell me. He told her. It came out in pieces, broken up by size and the sound of him moving around his kitchen, opening and closing cabinets the way people did when they were nervous and needed something to do with their hands. Her father had gotten into serious financial trouble 4 years ago. A bad investment, a partner who had disappeared with assets, debts that multiplied faster than he could manage them. He had gone to Dante Moretti because someone had told him Dante was someone who could help, and help quietly, without the kind of bureaucratic paper trail that would have destroyed what was left of Vincent Russo's reputation. He thought he could pay it back, Gerald said. He had a plan. He's been missing payments for over a year. I know. And nobody told me. Silence. He didn't want you to worry, Gerald finally said. You know how your father was. He never wanted you to think he couldn't handle things. Amelia pressed her knuckles against her teeth for a moment. She breathed through her nose. Thank you, Gerald, she said, and ended the call. She sat at the kitchen table with her dead father's letter and thought about the fact that for 5 years she had been walking into the office of the man her father owed $12 million to, and she had had absolutely no idea. No. The summons came 2 days later. Not a phone call, not an email. A car pulled up outside her apartment building at 8 in the morning, black, quiet, expensive, and a man she didn't recognize knocked on her door and said, Mr. Moretti would like to see you at the estate. Not a request. She got in the car. The drive took 40 minutes, long enough for her to run through every scenario she could imagine, arrange them in order of worst to less worse, and arrive at the conclusion that none of them were good. She watched the city thin out into quieter streets and larger properties, and thought about whether she should have called a lawyer. She didn't have a lawyer. She didn't have $12 million either. The estate was exactly what she had expected from a man like Dante. Large, immaculately maintained, communicating power without being vulgar about it. She had been here once before, years ago, to drop off documents during a weekend when the office systems had been down. She remembered the gate, the long driveway, the way the property felt sealed off from the rest of the world. Inside, she was shown to a sitting room. She was not offered anything to drink. She sat and waited for 11 minutes. She counted them. And then Dante walked in. She had seen Dante Moretti walk into rooms hundreds of times. She knew the way he moved, the deliberate unhurriedness of it, the way his presence rearranged the air in a space. But something was different today, and it took her a moment to identify what it was. He wasn't treating this like a meeting. He was treating it like an outcome. Amelia. He sat across from her, not behind a desk, which surprised her. No performance of bureaucratic distance. Just 2 chairs and a low table between them, and Dante Moretti watching her with those dark eyes that never told you what was happening behind them. I assume you know why I'm here, she said. I was sorry to hear about your father. Were you? The words came out flatter than she intended. He looked at her steadily. Yes, he said. Whatever you think of the circumstances, I'm not a man who takes pleasure in someone dying. He died owing you $12 million. He did. And now you've brought me here. She kept her hands folded in her lap. Her nails were digging into her own palms, and she was grateful for it. So let's skip the part where we're polite about it and get to what you actually want. Something moved across his face. She couldn't name it. In 5 years, she had learned to read most of his expressions, but this one was new. You've always done that, he said. Done what? Skipped straight to the center of things. He said it almost quietly, the way someone stated a fact they found genuinely interesting. Most people spend 20 minutes working up to what they mean. You never do. I don't have 20 minutes to waste. No. He picked up a folder from the table beside him. She hadn't noticed it sitting there, and opened it. You don't. The documents he slid across to her were detailed and complete. The original loan agreement, the repayment schedule, the missed payments, each one itemized with dates and amounts. Everything her father had signed laid out in front of her like a case being presented to a judge. The debt is valid, Dante said. The estate your father left behind covers perhaps $800,000 of it. The remainder is outstanding. I understand that. The legal channels available to me to recover that remainder would be significant. I understand that too. Then you understand your position. She looked up from the documents. I understand my position. I'm asking about yours. What do you actually want? He reached into the folder again and produced one more document. This one was shorter. A single page, dense with legal language, and at the top, a heading that she read and then read again because her brain refused to accept it the first time. Marriage contract. The silence lasted about 5 seconds. Absolutely not, she said. Read it first. I don't need to read it. You're proposing that I marry you as payment for a dead man's debt. Her voice was level. She was proud of it in the same hollow way she'd been proud of her steadiness on the hospital phone call. That is something I will not be discussing. Amelia, I will find another way to address this debt. I will work with whatever legal process is necessary. I will take on whatever I have to take on. She stood up. Her legs were steadier than she expected. But I will not be traded as a commodity because my father made a bad financial decision. Dante didn't stand. He looked up at her, and she braced herself for coldness, for the expression she'd seen him use on people who crossed him. Flat, dismissive, final. Instead, he said, "Sit down, please." The please threw her completely. She sat down. "I'm not asking you to pay a debt," he said. "I'm asking you to listen. Those are the same thing." They're not. He leaned forward slightly, forearms on his knees, and for the first time in 5 years, she was looking at Dante Moretti without the professional distance between them, without the desk or the agenda or the context of a meeting, and she noticed, irrelevantly, unhelpfully, that he looked tired. Not physically tired, the other kind. The debt will be forgiven regardless of your answer. I decided that before you walked in. She stared at him. Then why am I here? Because I've been trying to find a reason to ask you this for 3 years, and I couldn't find one that didn't make me look like a fool, and then your father's situation gave me an opening, and I used it. He paused, which I recognize is not a flattering thing to admit. Amelia opened her mouth, closed it. A laugh that was mostly disbelief escaped her before she could stop it. You're telling me you manufactured a coercive situation to ask me on, what, a date? A marriage proposal? I'm telling you I made a very poor decision driven by the fact that I didn't know how else to start this conversation. So, drop the contract. The contract isn't a threat. It's a proposal. There's a difference. One that requires a lawyer to explain. One that I'll explain right now, if you'll let me. He looked at her. Actually looked at her, and she had the disorienting sensation that she had been looked at by this man before, really looked at, and had simply never allowed herself to register it. Sit down, Amelia, not because I'm ordering you, because I'm asking you. She sat down. She didn't know why. 3 years ago, he said, you stayed late on a Thursday to finish the Reyes contract. You remember that? She remembered. She'd been there until past midnight. She'd ordered delivery because the kitchen staff had all gone home. What does that have to do with anything? I came back to the office around 11. I had forgotten something. You were at your desk and you had coffee and you were listening to music through one earphone, sir. Something old. I never found out what. And when I walked in, you didn't flinch. Every other person in my life flinches when I come into a room unexpectedly. His voice was even, factual. You just looked up and said, the coffee machine on the 4th floor is better than the one up here. You should try it sometime. She remembered saying it. She remembered thinking it was a stupid thing to say to her boss at 11 o'clock at night. That was the moment, she said carefully. That was when I understood what I was already feeling. He sat back. I've spent 3 years watching you work, watching you help people you didn't have to help, watching you do your job with more intelligence and more integrity than anyone I've ever employed. And believe me when I say I have high standards. A brief pause. I am not a man who is good at this. I don't have practice in saying these things, but I'm telling you the truth. Amelia looked at the contract still sitting on the table between them. If you're telling me the truth, she said slowly, then you know that forcing someone into a marriage, even with good intentions, even with the debt forgiven, isn't love. It's control. His jaw tightened. A tiny movement. She caught it because she'd spent 5 years reading him. "You're right," he said. "Then why is there still a contract on this table?" "Because I didn't know how else to ask you to stay." The words came out quieter than anything she'd heard from him. And that's the real answer. I'm not proud of it. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the $12 million, about her father, who had died with secrets, about the 5 years she'd spent in Dante Moretti's orbit, telling herself she wasn't paying attention when she very clearly had been. She thought about the fact that she was angrier right now than she had ever been in her life, and that somewhere underneath the anger was something she didn't want to examine yet. "I'll tell you what I'll do," she said finally. "I'll take the contract home. I'll read it. I'll have someone look at it." She stood up again. "And then I'll make a decision as a free adult who has a choice in the matter, not as a secretary, not as a daughter paying her father's debts." She met his eyes. "Is that acceptable to you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. She picked up the contract. She walked to the door. "Amelia!" She stopped but didn't turn around. "For what it's worth," Dante said, "I know this isn't how it should have been asked. I know that." She didn't answer him. She walked out of the estate, got into the car, and spent the entire 40-minute drive back to the city with the contract on her lap and her hands pressed flat against it, very carefully, not feeling anything at all. She knew herself well enough to know the feeling was already there. She just needed time to decide what to do with it. That night, she sat at the same kitchen table where she'd found her father's letter, and she read every word of the contract. It was thorough, it was detailed, and this was the part that kept stopping her, the part that made her read certain clauses 3 and 4 times, unexpectedly fair. There were provisions she hadn't anticipated, protections for her. Explicitly written, legally binding guarantees that she would maintain full control of her own finances. A clause stating that no decision regarding her personal activities, social connections, or professional aspirations could be made without her consent. Another clause, and this was the one that made her set the papers down and look at the ceiling for a full minute, that specified she could walk away at any time in the first 6 months if she decided the arrangement wasn't working. A man who wanted to own her didn't write those clauses. She picked the contract back up. She read it again. At 2 a.m, she called her only real friend, a woman named Clara, who had known her since college and who answered the phone with the exhausted acceptance of someone who had gotten late-night calls before. "My father owed Dante Moretti $12 million, Amelia said without preamble. "Dante has proposed marriage as a way to resolve the debt, except he also says the debt is forgiven regardless. And the contract he gave me has more protections in it than any employment agreement I've ever signed, and I don't know what to do with any of this." There was a long pause. "How do you feel about him?" Clara asked. "That's not the relevant question." "It's absolutely the relevant question." "Clara, Amelia." Her friend's voice was gentle in the way that meant she was about to say something true and unwelcome. "You have worked for that man for 5 years. You have never once complained about the job. You have turned down 2 other positions that would have paid you significantly more. When his name comes up in any conversation you have with me, your voice changes." A pause. "Tell me that's all professional admiration." Amelia said nothing. "That's what I thought," Clara said. "Get some sleep, then decide." She didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with her father's letter and Dante's contract in the particular silence of a city at 3 a.m, and she made herself be honest. She was furious at Dante for the way he'd done this. That was real, and it wasn't going away. But she was also sitting here at 3 a.m, reading every word of a marriage contract because she couldn't put it down. And that was real too. She picked up a pen. She was still furious. But she signed her name. She signed her name at 3 a.m. and immediately wanted to take it back. Not because she had changed her mind, because the moment the ink was dry, the reality of what she'd done settled onto her shoulders like something physical, a weight that pressed down and said, "You cannot undo this." She sat there looking at her own signature for a full 2 minutes. Her handwriting was neat. It always was. She had trained herself out of the nervous scrawl she'd had in college, taught herself to write with the controlled precision that professional life required. The signature looked calm. She was not calm. She folded the contract, put it in an envelope, and set it on the corner of the table. Then she went to bed and lay on her back staring at the ceiling until her alarm went off at 6:30. She showered, she dressed, she ate half a piece of toast standing over the kitchen sink because she couldn't make herself sit down again at that table. Then she picked up the envelope and called the car service. Dante was in his office when she arrived. This time, she hadn't been escorted. The front gate had opened when her car approached, and the staff member who met her at the door had brought her directly upstairs without a word, which told her that instructions had been given, that he had been expecting her, that some part of him had known she would come back. She didn't know whether that made her feel better or worse. He was on the phone when she walked in. He held up one finger. One moment, and she stood in the doorway of his office with the envelope in her hand and looked at the room she had been in dozens of times before as his employee. Everything looked the same. The dark wood desk, the city spread out behind him through floor-to-ceiling windows, the single lamp on the corner credenza that he always left on because he said overhead lighting gave him headaches. She had ordered that lamp. She had been the one who figured out that overhead lighting was the problem when he started getting tension headaches 3 years ago, and she'd ordered the lamp, and he'd never asked how it appeared. He ended the call. "You came back," he said. She crossed the room and put the envelope on his desk. He looked at it. He didn't pick it up immediately. He looked at it the way you looked at something you'd wanted for a long time and weren't sure you were allowed to have. "You signed it," he said. "I have conditions." His eyes moved to hers. "Tell me." "I'm not decorative." She kept her voice flat. "I'm not going to attend dinners and smile at people and pretend to be something I'm not. If I'm in your life, I'm in it as a person with a function and a perspective, not as an accessory." "Understood. I'm not going to be kept in the dark about things that affect me. If there's something I need to know about your world, about your business, about whatever situation we're walking into, I want to know it. I won't be the last person in the room to understand what's happening." "Also understood. And I won't be rushed." She held his gaze. "You've apparently been developing feelings for 3 years. You can wait a little longer. Whatever this is between us, if it becomes anything, it happens at a pace I'm comfortable with, not a pace dictated by a contract or by your patience level." There was a beat of silence. "Is that all?" he asked. "For now." He picked up the envelope and opened it. He unfolded the contract and looked at her signature, and she watched his face and caught something she hadn't expected. Relief. Not the satisfaction of a transaction completed. Relief. Raw and unguarded, gone in less than 2 seconds, but she'd seen it. "These conditions are acceptable," he said. "They're not negotiable." "I didn't say they were." He folded the contract back. "I said they were acceptable." She nodded once. "Then we'll figure out the rest." She turned to leave and he said, "You can move in Thursday." She stopped, turned back slowly. "I didn't agree to move in." "The contract specifies cohabitation." "I know what the contract specifies. I also know there's a clause that says the timeline for cohabitation is subject to mutual agreement." He blinked, just barely, the tiniest tell. "You read it very carefully." "I read everything carefully. It's why you hired me." She picked up her bag from the chair beside the door. "I'll move in when I'm ready. I'll let you know when that is." She walked out. She made it all the way to the car before her hands started shaking. Busk. She moved in on a Sunday. 12 days after she'd signed the contract, which she knew fell within the window allowed by the clause she'd cited, and which she'd calculated specifically to demonstrate that she was operating on her own timeline and not his. She brought 4 boxes and a suitcase. She left most of her furniture in her apartment, which she was keeping. That was another thing the contract had not anticipated her pushing on, and another thing Dante had conceded without visible argument, which she found, against her better judgment, slightly impressive. The room she was given was large, not the master bedroom. She had been specific about that. It was a suite at the end of the second-floor hallway with its own bathroom and a window that looked out over the back garden, and when the housekeeper, a stout, watchful woman named Rosa, who had apparently worked for the Moretti family for 20 years, showed her around the space, Amelia noticed immediately that someone had placed a small coffee maker on the dresser. The good kind. The kind she used at her own apartment. The exact same model. She stood and looked at it for a moment. "Mr. Moretti said you prefer to make your own in the morning," Rosa said, with the careful neutrality of a woman who had learned to say nothing and observe everything. "He's right," Amelia said. "Thank you." Rosa nodded and left. Amelia put her hand on the coffee maker. It was plugged in. It was stocked with the beans she used. She picked up her first box and started unpacking. The first week was quiet, uncomfortably quiet. The way quiet was when two people were both working very hard to be normal and both knew they were working at it. Dante was in the house in the evenings and sometimes at breakfast, and they spoke the way they had always spoken, about practical things, about schedules, about the minor logistics of sharing a space. He didn't press. He didn't create opportunities for the kind of conversations that would require her to know what she felt. He just existed in the same house with a consistency that was, she slowly realized, intentional. He was making himself predictable, safe in the boring, day-to-day sense of the word. She didn't say anything about it, but she noticed. The first crack appeared on day 9. She was in the small office she'd set up on the ground floor. She'd negotiated for a working space, another concession, reviewing documents for a meeting she had that week with a nonprofit she'd been supporting. She heard raised voices from somewhere deeper in the house. Not shouting exactly. The precise, clipped kind of loud that meant professional anger, carefully contained. She ignored it. Then she heard something break. Glass from the sound of it. She got up. The voices were coming from behind the closed door of what she'd been told was the private meeting room, a space she hadn't been invited into and hadn't asked about. She stood in the hallway and understood completely that walking toward that door was the opposite of smart. She walked toward it anyway. She didn't open it. She stopped 6 feet away and listened, and what she heard was 2 voices, Dante's and someone she didn't recognize. And they were speaking Italian, fast and low, and she understood only fragments, but the fragments were enough. Liability. Exposure. The name Ferraro. The door opened. The man who came out was 50-ish, heavy-set, with the red face of someone who had just been told something he didn't want to hear. He stopped when he saw her. His eyes moved over her with the particular assessment of a man who was placing her in a category. "Who is this?" he said. "This," Dante said from behind him, "is my wife." The word landed in the hallway like something physical. The man, she would learn later that his name was Marco Vitelli and that he was one of Dante's oldest associates, looked at her again. His expression shifted, not to warmth, to calculation. "I wasn't told about a wife," he said. "You weren't asked to be." Dante's voice was completely even. "We're done for today, Marco." Marco looked at Amelia one more time. Then he put on his coat, smiled at her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and said, "A pleasure, Mrs. Moretti," in a way that made it sound like a threat with good manners. He left. She waited until she heard the front door close. "Who is Ferraro?" she said. Dante was quiet for half a second too long. "Where did you hear that name?" "Through the door. I heard you arguing." "You should have stayed in your office." "You told me I wouldn't be kept in the dark." "That was about things that affect you." "A man just looked at me like he was filing me away for future reference. That affects me." She held his gaze. "Who is Ferraro?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped back from the doorway and said, "Come in." She walked into the meeting room. There was broken glass in the corner. A tumbler looked like. No one had cleaned it up yet. She noticed Dante noticed her noticing it, and some calculation happened behind his eyes. "Salvatore Ferraro runs the Eastern Territory," Dante said. "He and I have had an arrangement for years. That arrangement is becoming complicated." "Complicated how?" "He believes I'm weak." His voice didn't change. It was completely factual, like reporting weather. "He's been testing that belief for the last 4 months. Small things. A shipment rerouted. A meeting canceled without notice. A payment delayed past the agreed window." "And Marco?" "Marco is Marco." Brief. Dismissive in a way that told her more than the dismissal was supposed to. "He thinks I should respond more aggressively before Ferraro gets the wrong idea." "What do you think?" He looked at her. "I think I need more information before I escalate something that can't be de-escalated." "That's a reasonable position." "Marco doesn't think so." "Marco broke a glass in your meeting room." She looked at the corner where the shards still were. Marco's emotional regulation doesn't seem calibrated for reasonable positions. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Close enough. No, it's not. She turned to go. Amelia. She stopped. Thank you, he said, for asking. She didn't answer that. She walked back to her office and sat down at her desk and realized that her heart was beating faster than it should have been for a conversation about business logistics. She pulled up her documents and made herself focus. The second crack happened 4 days later. She had found the thing by accident. She wasn't snooping. She genuinely wasn't. She had been looking for a phone charger in the hallway closet, one of those general utility spaces that held things like extra linens and light bulbs and the kind of accumulated domestic miscellany that said a house had been lived in for years. She found the charger. She also found, on the shelf above it, a photograph in a small frame. A woman she didn't know. Dark-haired, mid-40s, with Dante's same angular jaw and something in her eyes that was familiar in a way Amelia couldn't immediately place. Beside the photograph was a single dried flower, the kind that had been pressed flat, white petals gone slightly translucent with age. She put the charger in her pocket and put the photograph back exactly where she'd found it. At dinner that night, they ate together most evenings. Another thing that had happened gradually without either of them formally deciding it. She said, "Is there a photograph in the hallway closet on the second floor?" Dante's fork paused for half a second. "Yes." "Your mother?" He looked at her. "Yes." "She had your jaw." Another pause. He set his fork down. "People usually say I have hers." "Which came first?" Something in his face that she couldn't entirely read. "She died when I was 19, he said. "Heart failure. Very sudden." "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." "It doesn't feel like a long time ago. Otherwise, it wouldn't still be in the closet." His eyes moved to hers and held there, and she understood she had just said something more direct than he had expected. She hadn't meant to. It had come out because she was tired and not monitoring herself the way she usually did. "No," he said after a moment. "It doesn't." They ate the rest of dinner in silence, but it was different from the earlier silences. Less performance in it. She thought about that later, about how silence could change texture depending on what had just been said. The argument happened on day 23. She had been handling it. She had been genuinely handling it. The adjustment, the strangeness, the daily negotiation of sharing space with a man whose world operated by rules she didn't fully understand. She had been keeping her equilibrium, maintaining the boundaries she'd set, and watching and learning and not letting herself get pulled off center. Then she found out about Paolo. Paolo was 22 years old. He had worked, in the vehicle pool driving for Dante's associates. He was also, she discovered from an overheard conversation between two household staff members in the kitchen when they didn't know she was in the adjacent hallway, 3 months behind on payments to Dante for a loan he'd taken to cover his mother's medical bills. The staff members were whispering because they were worried, because the word being passed around was that Marco had recommended the situation be handled by the book, which meant Paolo's debt would be called in, publicly, in a way that would effectively destroy the young man's ability to work in this city in any capacity for the foreseeable future. She waited until she found Dante alone. He was in his study. She opened the door without knocking, which she had never done before, and the look he gave her said he registered it. "Paolo," she said. He set down his pen. "You heard." "I heard enough. He borrowed money for his mother's medical care. He's 22 years old, and he's been making partial payments every month, which tells me he's genuinely trying—" "Amelia." "Don't Amelia me. I'm talking." She took a breath. "This is the thing I said I needed from you. I said if you wanted what's between us to become real, you needed to understand the values that make me who I am. I'm not asking you to forgive every debt in your ledger. I'm not naive enough to think that's how this works. But this specific situation, a 22-year-old kid trying to take care of his mother, this one matters." Dante said nothing. "If you let Marco make an example of him," she said, "I need to know that. Because I need to know what kind of man I'm actually living with." His jaw was tight. She could see the muscle working. You're asking me to override an associate's recommendation in front of the organization, he said. I'm asking you to do the right thing. It's more complicated than, is it? She didn't move. Is it actually complicated, or are you telling yourself it's complicated because the easy version of complicated lets you off the hook? He stood up. For one moment, she was genuinely unsure. She had pushed hard and fast, and she didn't know this version of him, the one with his hands flat on the desk and his eyes absolutely still. You don't understand what it costs, he said quietly, when I am seen to extend mercy in this world. Then make it cost something. She met his eyes. Do it anyway. The silence stretched. She didn't look away. He looked at her for a long time, the kind of looking that wasn't about seeing what was in front of him, but about deciding something. And then he said, "Get out of my study." Her stomach dropped. She nodded once, turned, and walked to the door. "And tell Rosa to have Paolo come to the house tomorrow morning," he said behind her. She stopped. "The debt will be restructured," Dante said, his voice back to flat and controlled. "Payments reduced to something manageable. Marco will not be told about this conversation." She turned back. He was standing behind his desk and he looked not angry anymore. He looked like a man who had just done something that cost him and was deciding whether he regretted it. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet." His eyes moved to hers. "Marco won't stay quiet when he finds out, and he will find out. Things like this always surface. Then we deal with it when it surfaces." "We," he said, a strange weight in the word. "We," she confirmed, "unless you'd prefer I go back to staying in my office and pretending your world doesn't exist." He held her gaze. Something was shifting between them. She could feel it. The subtle tectonic movement of two people who had been orbiting each other slowly beginning to change course. "No," he said, "I wouldn't prefer that." She went back to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed with her hands in her lap and her heart going too fast again, and she thought, this is getting complicated. She had known it would. She had signed the contract knowing it would. But knowing and feeling were two different countries, and she was standing at the border. But it was Rosa who came to find her 2 weeks later. It was just after 11 at night, and Rosa's face, always carefully composed, always professionally neutral, was doing something Rosa's face almost never did. It was frightened. "Mrs. Moretti," her voice was barely above a whisper. "There's a situation." "Tell me." "Marco Vitelli arrived 40 minutes ago. He brought 2 men with him. They're in the East Wing with Mr. Moretti." Rosa's hands were clasped in front of her, white-knuckled. "Mr. Moretti told all the staff to stay upstairs. He didn't include you in that instruction. I don't know if that was deliberate." Amelia was already on her feet. "It was deliberate, Ushim," she said. "Stay upstairs, Rosa." She went downstairs. The voices were coming from the East Wing sitting room, and she didn't try to be quiet about her approach, because quiet would be a disadvantage here, and she had no interest in being caught listening at another door. She walked to the sitting room and opened it. Marco Vitelli was standing in the center of the room. His 2 men, large, quiet, the furniture of power, were positioned near the walls. Dante was standing at the window with his back half turned, and when Amelia walked in, he turned fully, and the expression on his face moved through 3 things very fast. Surprise, something that might have been fear, and then a hardening that locked everything else out. "I thought I told Rosa to keep everyone upstairs," he said. "You told the staff to stay upstairs. I'm not staff." She looked at Marco. "Mr. Vitelli." Marco's eyes moved over her. The same calculation from the hallway, except it had more texture to it now, more information behind it. He had clearly done his research on who she was since the last time they'd stood in proximity. "Mrs. Moretti," he said, with that same terrible courtesy. "You should go back upstairs. I'm comfortable here. This is a private discussion. Between my husband and his associate in our house." She stepped into the room properly, letting the door fall closed behind her. "I'm comfortable here." Marco looked at Dante. Something passed between them. A question asked and an answer given, though neither of them spoke. And then Marco exhaled slowly through his nose. "The Paolo situation," he said. He still hadn't taken his eyes off Dante. "I heard about the restructuring. I heard about the change made without consultation." The decision was mine to make, Dante said. The precedent is everyone's problem. Marco's voice was still even. This was the controlled anger Amelia recognized, the scarier kind. When someone doesn't pay, there are consequences. When there are no consequences, everyone gets ideas. Paolo is 22. His mother was dying. Paolo is an entry in a ledger, Dante, the same as everyone else. Marco glanced at Amelia, a meaningful glance. I understand there was influence exerted. Watch yourself, Dante said. Very quiet. I'm watching myself. Marco's eyes came back to Dante's and stayed there. I'm watching all of us. Ferraro is watching too. You know what he sees when he looks at this house right now? He sees a man who overruled his own people for a woman who's been here less than a month. He sees softness, and Ferraro doesn't leave softness alone, Dante. You know that. The room was completely still. Say what you came to say, Dante said. I came to say that this needs to stop. Whatever arrangement you've made here, whatever personal considerations are at play, they cannot enter the work. They cannot change how decisions are made. Marco's voice dropped. If you cannot keep them separate, other people will start asking questions about your capacity to lead. And those questions, once they're in circulation... He stopped. Let the silence finish it. Amelia had been standing still through all of this. She had watched Marco talk, and she had watched Dante listen, and she had felt, underneath everything, the specific quality of a moment that was about to break in one direction or another. She said, Mr. Vitelli? Marco looked at her. You came here at 11 o'clock at night with two men you positioned near the walls. You want Dante to believe this is a conversation. She kept her voice even. She kept her hands loose at her sides. But conversations don't need strategic positioning. That tells me what you're actually saying is something you don't want on record. Marco was very still. I'm not naive enough to think I understand your world fully, she continued. I'm also not naive enough to pretend I don't understand what a threat sounds like when it's dressed up as concern. She looked at him directly. What you're suggesting is that Dante demonstrate he isn't influenced by his wife by proving he isn't influenced by his wife. The way he's supposed to prove it is by undoing a decision that was just and human and right. And the subtext of what you're saying is that if he doesn't, you'll tell Ferraro he's weak. The two men near the walls were very quiet. Dante hadn't moved. Marco looked at Amelia for a long moment. You're smart, he said finally, not a compliment. I know. She didn't look away. And I'm not going anywhere. The statement landed in the room, and she felt it land. Felt the exact moment it became a different kind of problem than the one Marco had walked in with. She wasn't just a wife who had influenced a business decision. She was someone who understood what was happening and wasn't going to pretend she didn't. Marco looked at Dante. Control your household, he said very softly. And then he nodded at his men and walked out. The sound of the front door closing was like a period at the end of a sentence. Dante stood at the window and didn't speak for a moment. You just made yourself a target, he said. I already was one, the moment I walked into that room. She looked at him. Did I make things worse? His jaw worked. His eyes stayed on the middle distance. You made things different, he said. Different and worse aren't the same thing. That's not reassuring. It wasn't meant to be reassuring. He finally turned to look at her, and what was in his face stopped her. It was the rawness she'd caught that first day in his office, but bigger now, harder to contain. You understand what you did in there? You put yourself between me and a man who is actively looking for a reason to act against this family. You did it deliberately and calmly, and you knew exactly what you were doing. Yes. Why? She thought about giving him the measured answer, the practical one, the one that stayed inside the terms of their arrangement. She thought about protecting the distance she'd been maintaining, the careful architecture of boundaries and conditions, and not yet and not rushing. She said, because he was wrong, and because you're my husband. She said it in the same flat, matter-of-fact voice she used for everything, and she watched it hit him. Dante Moretti, who controlled rooms and frightened powerful people, and had spent his whole adult life being the most dangerous person in any given space, looked at her like she'd just done something he didn't have words for. Go to bed, he said, very quietly. We'll deal with the rest tomorrow. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the house settle and thought about the fact that she had just called him her husband, not as a legal formality, not as a contractual notation, and she had meant it. That was the thing that kept her awake. She had meant it, and there was no taking it back. And somewhere between the contract she'd signed and the broken glass in a meeting room, and a 22-year-old kid named Paolo, and a man who put her exact coffee maker in her room without being asked, somewhere in all of that, the line had moved. She didn't know exactly when. She just knew that on the other side of Marco Vitelli, walking out of their house at 11 o'clock at night, she was standing somewhere she couldn't walk back from. She slept 4 hours. When she woke at 5:40 in the morning, the house was quiet in the particular way that meant everyone in it was either asleep or pretending to be. She lay still for a moment, looking at the ceiling, running through what had happened the night before the way you ran your tongue over a sore tooth. Not because it helped, but because you couldn't stop yourself. She had called him her husband and meant it. She got up, made coffee, and sat at the small desk in her room with her laptop open, trying to focus on anything practical. She had work, real work, separate from this house and this arrangement. The nonprofit consultation, 3 pending emails she'd been putting off, a budget review she'd promised to have finished by the end of the week. She opened the first email and read it twice and retained nothing. At 7, she went downstairs. Dante was already in the kitchen. This was unusual. He was typically in his office by 6:30, already into the first layer of his day before most people had finished their coffee. He was standing at the counter with a cup in his hand, not sitting, not reading anything, just standing the way people stood when they were waiting for something they weren't sure was coming. He looked at her when she walked in. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "Some." She went to the coffee maker. "You?" "No." She didn't say anything to that. She made her coffee and stood beside him at the counter, and they were quiet together for a moment, which should have been uncomfortable and wasn't, which was itself a kind of information. "Marco will move quickly," Dante said. "How quickly?" "Days, maybe less." He set his cup down. "What you did last night, standing in that room saying what you said, he won't forget it, and he won't frame it the way it actually was. He'll take it to Ferraro as evidence." "Evidence of what?" "That I've lost my judgment." His voice was flat, not angry, tired in the bone-deep way, that I've brought a liability into the center of my operation. "I'm not a liability." "I know that." He looked at her. "Ferraro won't care." She wrapped both hands around her mug and thought, "Then we need to get ahead of it." "We." There it is again? She looked at him steadily. "Do you want me to stop saying that?" He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I don't." "Then tell me what getting ahead of it looks like." He told her. It was methodical and unemotional, and she listened carefully, the way she'd always listened in meetings, catching the things being said between the words as much as the words themselves. Dante had 2 allies in the organization who he trusted, or trusted as much as he trusted anyone, and his plan was to move information through those channels before Marco could shape the narrative. It was damage control, essentially, the kind she understood from a different context, a different life, but the mechanics were the same. "What can I do?" she asked. "Stay visible. Don't disappear into the house. If you're seen to be, normal, present, comfortable." He paused. "It undermines the story Marco wants to tell. You want me to perform being fine. I want you to be fine. If you can manage it." She looked at him. "I'm fine," she said. "I'm not performing." Something in his face shifted, that complicated thing again, the one she still didn't have a name for. "All right," he said. She finished her coffee. She was not entirely fine, but she was functional, which in her experience was usually enough. Fine. For 3 days, the house operated on a kind of heightened normalcy that felt like holding your breath with good posture. Dante was in and out, present at meals, present in the evenings, and she could see him managing things she wasn't fully privy to. Phone calls taken in the study with the door closed, 2 brief meetings with men she didn't recognize who came and went without being introduced. She didn't push on the closed doors. She waited. On the 4th day, his ally arrived. His name was Nico Beretti, and he was Dante's age, lean and quick-eyed, with the kind of face that could slide between friendly and dangerous so fast you almost missed the transition. He came to dinner, which Rosa served with the slightly amplified formality she used when guests were significant, and he was charming in a way that Amelia read immediately as professional rather than personal. Everything calibrated, nothing wasted. He talked. She listened. He asked her questions about herself, careful questions with built-in flattery, and she answered them honestly and briefly and watched him take inventory of her answers. He was assessing her. She understood that. She let him. At the end of dinner, when Dante went to take a call, Nico leaned back in his chair and looked at her with an expression that had dropped the performance. "You know what you've walked into," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm learning," she said. "Marco is not a small problem." "I know." He's been Dante's second for 11 years. That's 11 years of relationships, debts, loyalty. Nico's eyes were level. He doesn't move without calculating every angle first. When he comes, it won't look like coming. It'll look like something else. What kind of something else? That's what I'm trying to figure out. He picked up his wine glass, set it down without drinking. "Mrs. Moretti, can I ask you something direct? You've been doing that for an hour. Might as well make it explicit." That got a brief, real smile. "How much do you actually know about how your father came to borrow money from this organization?" She went very still. The question landed differently than anything else he'd said. Not because it was rude, because it snagged on something. A small loose thread she hadn't known was there until something pulled on it. "He needed money," she said carefully. "A business investment went wrong. Do you know who connected him to Dante?" "A mutual contact. Someone my father trusted." She kept her voice neutral. "Why are you asking me this?" Nico looked at her for a moment. "No reason that can't wait," he said, and picked up his wine glass again, and Dante came back to the table, and the conversation moved on. But she felt it, the pulled thread, loose end of something she hadn't examined. She thought about it that night. She went back to what Gerald had told her, a partner who disappeared with assets, someone who had suggested Moretti Holdings as a solution. She had accepted the outline of that story because she'd been grieving and overwhelmed, and the mechanics hadn't felt like the important part. Now they did. She went to her desk. She opened her laptop. She started looking up. She found the name in a 3-year-old email in the account she'd had before switching providers. An email from her father, one of the few he'd sent directly to her email rather than calling, which meant it had been something he needed to have in writing for himself. The email was short. It said he'd found someone who could help with the situation. A man named Callum Reyes, who knew people and could make introductions. She sat back in her chair. Callum Reyes. She knew that name. She had typed that name into contracts. She had scheduled meetings where that name appeared on the attendee list. She had prepared briefing documents in which Callum Reyes was identified as one of Dante's suppliers, a man who operated in the gray edges of the import business and who had been, in the last year of her employment, increasingly mentioned in meetings as a source of friction. She put her hands flat on the desk. She breathed. Then she got up and walked down the hall to Dante's study. She knocked. He said, "Come in." She came in. He was at his desk with papers in front of him, and he looked up and registered something in her face immediately. She could see him register it, and he set his pen down. "What happened?" he said. "Callum Reyes." Complete stillness. "What about him?" Dante said. "He was the one who connected my father to you." She watched his face, watched it very carefully. "He was the introduction, the mutual contact, the person my father trusted who told him that borrowing money from Moretti Holdings was a safe option." Dante said nothing. "Did you know that?" she said. A beat. One single beat, and in that beat she felt the floor shift under her feet. "Yes," he said. The word was so quiet, so flat, like he'd been waiting for it to come out. And now that it had, there was nothing left to do but let it sit there. She stood in the middle of his study, and the full shape of it assembled itself in her mind with horrible clarity. Callum Reyes, who worked for Dante, who had approached her father, who had offered a solution to a desperate man, and her father had taken it, and the debt had grown, and Dante had known from the beginning exactly who Amelia Russo was before she'd ever walked into a job interview. "You knew who I was," she said, "before you hired me." "Yes." "The job. The 5 years." Her voice was completely level. She didn't recognize it as her own. "You manufactured all of it." "It's more complicated." "Did you manufacture it?" Not a question, a statement that needed confirmation or denial and nothing else. He stood up. "Amelia, answer me." His jaw tightened. "Reyes told me about your father's situation, that your father needed money. I looked into it. I looked into your father's circumstances, and I found you." He stopped. "I was not going to hire you because of that. I had decided against it. And then you came in for the interview, and you sat across from me, and you told me my office layout was inefficient, and that the reason I kept losing documents was because my filing system had a structural flaw, and you'd identified both problems in the 20 minutes you'd been waiting outside." She stared at him. "I hired you because you were extraordinary," he said, "not because of your father. That part, I want you to understand, that part was coincidence that became information. The hiring was real. But you knew." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she hated it. "You knew about the debt. You knew Reyes had set my father up. For 5 years you knew my father was caught in something that your man helped create, and you said nothing. Your father borrowed money freely. Reyes made an introduction. He didn't coerce. He preyed on a desperate man." The control snapped. It just snapped, and the anger came out not as shouting, but as something colder and more focused, which was worse. "He found someone in trouble and pointed him at a shark and called it help. And you knew. You sat across from me for 5 years at meetings and briefings and late nights in the office, and you knew who my father was and what he owed you, and you never—" She stopped, pressed her hand against her sternum for a moment. "You let me believe that my father's debt to you was an accident, a tragedy, something that just happened. I did not orchestrate your father's debt. You benefited from it. You used it." She looked at him and felt something she'd been carefully, deliberately building over the past weeks develop a crack that ran all the way through it. "The contract, the marriage. You said the opportunity to ask me was something the debt provided. Except the debt wasn't a coincidence. It was a chain your organization helped create." He was quiet. "Say something," she said. "I don't have an argument to make," he said. "Not one that addresses what you're actually saying. What you're saying is true." She stared at him. "Then why?" she said. "If you already knew me, if you'd already watched me for 5 years, why the contract at all? Why not just tell me the truth?" "Because the truth sounds like what you just said it sounds like." His voice was rough in a way she'd never heard from him. "It sounds like manipulation from the beginning. And telling you that the beginning was contaminated by something I didn't fully control would have meant losing you before I ever had a chance to—" He stopped. "I made a decision to tell you in the wrong order, to let you know me first, so that when the truth came, you'd have more context than just the worst version of it." "That's not your decision to make." "I know. You took my choice away. Again, just in a different direction." "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had given her a coffee maker, and remembered she skipped meals and argued with Marco Vitelli on behalf of a 22-year-old kid, and who had also known for 5 years that the ground under her feet was built on something crooked. "I need you to leave," she said. "This is my study. I know, I need you to leave it." He looked at her. Then he walked around the desk, and he stopped when he was close, closer than he usually stood, close enough that she could see the specific quality of what was in his face, which was not guilt exactly and not shame exactly, but something underneath both of those things, older and harder to fix. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know you are," she said. "Leave." He left. She sat down in his chair, the one behind his desk, and put her head in her hands and breathed, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way she'd trained herself to breathe through things that wanted to overwhelm her. She thought about her father, about a man she'd loved and occasionally found infuriating and who had died with secrets. She thought about him sitting across from Callum Reyes, whoever Reyes had been to him, trusting someone who had been placed in his path by an organization that would eventually hold that trust against him. She thought about 5 years of Monday mornings and late Thursdays, and the lamp, and the coffee maker, and every small detail Dante had held in his head without her knowing he was holding them. She thought about signing the contract at 3 in the morning. She thought about meaning it when she said, "My husband." She didn't cry. She hadn't cried since the hospital hallway, and she wasn't going to start now in another man's chair in another man's house. She pressed her palms flat on the desk and felt the wood under them, solid and real, and she breathed until she trusted herself to stand up. She found Rosa in this kitchen at 10 o'clock, washing a dish that didn't need washing, which Amelia had learned was Rosa's version of anxious hovering. "Is there anything you need, Mrs. Moretti?" Rosa said. "Tell me about Callum Reyes." Rosa's hand stopped moving. "I know you know who he is," Amelia said. "You've been in this house 20 years. You know everyone." Rosa set the dish down. She turned around and her face was doing the thing Amelia had seen once before. The frightened thing, underneath the professional composure. "He doesn't come here anymore," she said carefully. "Mr. Moretti cut ties with him, about 8 months ago." "Why?" Rosa looked at her hands. "There were questions about how he did business, about who he made introductions to and why. Questions that Dante asked. Questions that came up during a review." She paused. Mr. Moretti was not pleased with what the review found. 8 months ago. Amelia ran the math without meaning to. 8 months ago was after she had signed the contract, after she was in this house, which meant Dante had reviewed Reyes's conduct after she arrived, had looked at the full picture of what Reyes had done with access to his operation, and had cut him loose, which meant Dante had looked at what had happened to her father and decided it was wrong, after the fact, not before. Not in time to stop any of it, but he'd looked. "Thank you, Rosa," she said. She went back upstairs. Nico Beretti called the next morning. She picked up because it was Nico's number and she wanted information more than she wanted to be careful. "You found out," he said. Not a question. "About Reyes?" "Yes. I was going to tell you at dinner. Dante asked me not to. We had a disagreement about that. You were asking me about it, the questions at the end of dinner. I was checking how much you already knew and whether—" A pause. "Whether you should know the rest." She sat up straighter. "What's the rest?" A beat. "Marco knew about your father's debt before Dante did. Reyes reported to Marco first. The original intention was to use the debt, and by extension you, as leverage against Dante if he ever stepped out of line." His voice was level. "Giving her information the way you handed someone a grenade. You weren't brought to Dante's attention because of your father's debt. You were brought to Marco's attention. Dante found out about your father independently, 6 months after you started working there." She was silent. "Dante didn't create the situation," Nico said. "He found the situation and chose not to fully disclose it. Those are different crimes." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Marco is going to use it. When he moves against Dante, and he will move soon, he will tell you the worst version of this story. He will make you a weapon against your own husband." His voice was careful now, every word placed. "I'm telling you first so that when he does, you know it's a weapon and not the truth." She pressed her hand flat against her knee and thought, "What is Marco planning?" "I don't have specifics. I have enough to know it's coming fast and that it will involve you directly." He paused. "Amelia, whatever you're feeling about Dante right now, and I imagine it's complicated, this is not the moment to be separated from him. Marco needs you angry and isolated. Don't give him that." She ended the call. She sat on the edge of her bed for exactly 2 minutes. She counted them. Then she stood up and walked down the hall and knocked on Dante's study door. "Come in," he said. His voice was careful, expecting whatever was coming. She opened the door. He was at his desk, and he looked up at her, and she could see he hadn't slept either. "Marco knew about my father before you did," she said. "Reyes was reporting to Marco. You were supposed to be the leverage." Something moved across Dante's face. "How do you know that?" "Nico told me." She stepped into the room. Did you know about Marco's involvement with Reyes? I suspected, he said. I didn't have confirmation until the review 8 months ago. And you didn't tell me that either. No. Because you were protecting me. Because I was trying to... He stopped. Yes. Because I was trying to control the information, which is the same instinct that got us here, and I'm aware of the irony. She looked at him. She was still angry. That hadn't resolved, and she knew it wasn't going to resolve quickly. Anger like this, the kind rooted in something real and structural, didn't dissolve in a conversation. It metabolized slowly. She would be working through this for a long time. But she also looked at the man in front of her and thought about Rosa, saying, Mr. Moretti was not pleased with what the review found, and she thought about Nico disagreeing with Dante about her right to know, which meant Dante had been argued with by people he trusted and had still made a wrong call, which was a different thing from not caring. Wrong wasn't the same as malicious. She had to decide what to do with the difference. Marco is moving against us, she said. Nico doesn't know exactly how. I know, Dante said. I've been trying to get ahead of it. How? I have a meeting tomorrow with Ferraro directly, bypassing Marco entirely. If I can establish direct communication with Ferraro, it removes Marco's ability to be the filter on what Ferraro believes about me. That's a significant move. It's a necessary one. She looked at him. I'm going with you. He stared at her. Absolutely not. I'm not asking. Amelia, Ferraro is not Marco. Ferraro is... I know who Ferraro is. She met his eyes. I've been reading, I've been listening. I know exactly who Salvatore Ferraro is. She paused. And I know that walking into that meeting with your wife, with someone Ferraro didn't anticipate, someone who isn't from your world and can't be placed in his usual categories, changes his read of you. It makes you unpredictable. It makes you someone with something new to protect, which is different from someone going soft. Dante was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before, not the rawness, something quieter and more complicated underneath it. You've been thinking about this, he said. I've been thinking about a lot of things. You're still angry with me. Yes. And you're still willing to walk into a room with Ferraro. I told you, she said. Those aren't the same decision. She held his gaze. You have a lot to answer for. We're going to have that conversation, and it's going to be a long one, and I'm not pretending it doesn't need to happen. She paused. But right now, Marco Vitelli wants us separate and reactive, and I'm not going to give him that. We deal with the external threat first, then we deal with us. Dante was quiet for a long moment. You understand, he said carefully, that if you walk into Ferraro's meeting with me, you are fully inside this world, not at the edges, not as a civilian who can claim distance. He held her gaze. There's no version of that where you can go back to being someone who doesn't know things. I already know things. She looked at him. That door closed the night Marco stood in our sitting room. I walked through it then. I'm not pretending otherwise. He looked at her for a long, still moment. Then he said, The meeting is at noon tomorrow, at Ferraro's restaurant, private room in the back. She nodded. She turned to leave. Amelia? His voice stopped her at the door. Whatever happens, I need you to know that nothing about my feelings for you has ever been, don't, she said. Not unkindly. Not right now. We'll get through tomorrow first. She walked back to her room. She sat down at her desk and opened her laptop and began researching Salvatore Ferraro with the same methodical focus she brought to everything. His history, his associations, the particular pressure points of a man who had spent 40 years building an empire on the principle that information was the real currency of power. She read for 4 hours. She was terrified. She was clear-eyed about being terrified, which was different from letting the terror make decisions. She had walked into Dante Moretti's office for 5 years as a woman who was good at her job and careful about her distance, and she had believed she was in control of her own story. Now she knew the story had been larger than she'd seen. The edges of it extended into places she hadn't looked, touched people she'd loved, moved in directions she hadn't chosen and couldn't undo. She could be a woman that happened to. Or she could be a woman who looked at all of it. The deceptions and the real feelings and the crooked foundation and the man who had cut Reyes loose 8 months ago because he'd looked at what Reyes had done and decided it was wrong, and chose what to do next with both eyes open. At 2 in the morning, she closed the laptop. She set her alarm for 7. She was walking into Ferraro's private room in 10 hours, and she needed to be sharper than she had ever been in her life, because Salvatore Ferraro was going to look at her and make a calculation, and the calculation he made in those first 60 seconds would determine everything that came after. She lay down. She closed her eyes. She was not the secretary anymore. She wasn't entirely sure what she was yet. But she knew one thing with the cold, precise certainty she reserved for facts she had verified from multiple sources. Whatever she was walking into tomorrow, she was walking in as herself, and she was not walking in afraid. The fear was there. She just wasn't going to let it drive. She was dressed by 7:15, not dressed up, not performing. She put on the charcoal blazer she wore when she needed to feel like herself in rooms that wanted to reduce her, dark trousers, flat shoes she could move in. She looked at herself in the mirror for exactly 10 seconds, not checking, just anchoring. And then she went downstairs. Dante was already at the table. He had coffee and no food in front of him, which told her he hadn't eaten, which told her he'd been up most of the night. He looked at her when she came in, and she watched him take in what she was wearing, the way she was standing, the specific quality of her composure. "You look ready," he said. "I am ready." She poured coffee. "What do I need to know about Ferraro before we walk in?" "He respects directness. Not aggression. Directness. There's a difference with him." Dante wrapped both hands around his cup. "He'll try to read you in the first 2 minutes. He'll ask you something that sounds like small talk and isn't. Whatever he asks, answer it honestly. He has an extraordinary ability to detect when people are managing him." "What does he want from this meeting?" "He wants to know if I'm still worth the arrangement." His voice was flat, factual. Marco has been in his ear for weeks. Ferraro is not reactive. He thinks long, but he's close to a decision about whether I'm a liability or an asset, and today tips it one way or the other. What tips it in our direction? Showing him something Marco can't account for. Dante looked at her. "You." She drank her coffee. "What time do we leave?" 10:30. She nodded. "Eat something," she said. "You can't think straight when you're running on empty." He blinked, just barely. Then he called Rosa. Ciao. The restaurant was 40 minutes from the estate, in a part of the city that looked respectable from the outside and was very specifically curated to look that way. The building was narrow, dark brick, the sign above the door understated. Nothing about it said, "This is where Salvatore Ferraro conducts business that shapes the power structure of this city." That was the point. They went in through the side entrance. A man in a dark jacket met them at the door and didn't speak, just led them through a kitchen that was running full lunch service. Real food, real staff, real noise, and through a heavy door at the back into a hallway that was carpeted and quiet and belonged to a completely different building than the one they'd entered. Another door. This one opened into a private room with a rectangular table, 6 chairs, and Salvatore Ferraro already seated at the far end. He was older than she'd expected from the photographs she'd found. Late 60s, white-haired, with a face that had settled into the particular density of a man who hadn't been surprised by much in 30 years. He had a glass of water in front of him and nothing else. No associates in the room, just him. That was a choice. She noted it. He looked at Dante when they walked in, and then he looked at her, and she held his gaze without offering anything. No smile, no deference, no apologetic readjustment of her posture. She just looked at him the way you looked at someone whose measure you were also taking. His eyebrows moved. A fraction. "Dante," he said, "I was told you might bring your wife." "I don't usually announce my decisions in advance," Dante said, pulling out a chair for her and then taking the one beside her. "You know that." "I do." Ferraro's eyes were still on Amelia. "Mrs. Moretti." "I've heard your name recently." "I imagine you have," she said, "from one source in particular." "Marco Vitelli." "Yes." She settled into her chair. "I imagine he had interesting things to say." Ferraro's mouth moved. Not a smile, something adjacent. He had emphatic things to say. Whether they were interesting depends on who's listening. He picked up his water glass. "He tells me you've become a disruption. He tells you I influenced a business decision that he disagreed with." She kept her voice even. "Those aren't the same thing." "In this world, they might be." In any world they might be, she said. The question is whether the decision was right, not whether I influenced it. If the decision was wrong, that's worth examining. If it was right, and the problem is who suggested it, that's a different conversation. Ferraro looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Dante. She talks like this normally? Yes, Dante said. He set his glass down. The Paolo situation. That's what Marco brought to me. A debt forgiven, or restructured, on the recommendation of a woman who has been in this organization's orbit for less than a month as a wife. He looked back at Amelia. What would you say to that? I'd say the debt wasn't forgiven. It was restructured to a repayment schedule the debtor could actually meet, which means the money is still coming back, just over a longer period. She held his gaze. Forgiving the debt would have been sentimental. Restructuring it was practical. The distinction seems to have gotten lost in Marco's version. Ferraro was quiet. The boy's mother needed medical care, she continued. He borrowed money because he had no other option, and he's been paying it back as consistently as his income allows. Writing him off publicly would have destroyed his ability to work in this city, which would have guaranteed you'd never see the rest of that money, and it would have sent a message to everyone else in your network that personal catastrophe means immediate ruin. She paused. That's not strength. That's a policy that eats your own people. The room was very still. Dante's hand was on the table beside hers, not touching, close. Ferraro looked at her for a long moment. You studied me before this meeting, he said. Yes. What did you find? A man who has survived 40 years in an industry that disposes of most people in the first decade, she said. That means adaptability. The ability to revise a position when the information changes. You're not still running this organization on the same assumptions you started with. Those assumptions would be obsolete. She looked at him steadily. Marco is operating on an old model, one that worked in a different environment. What he's calling softness is actually Dante making a calibration for current conditions. Ferraro tapped one finger on the table. Once. The room felt it. Current conditions, he repeated. People are watching how organizations treat their own, she said. Not from the outside, from the inside. When your own people see that personal crisis means public destruction, you don't get loyalty. You get people who are already planning their exit before they're pushed. Ferraro looked at Dante. Where did you find her? She found me, Dante said. She was your secretary. For 5 years. And now she's sitting across from me making the most cogent argument I've heard for a position I was prepared to dismiss. Ferraro looked back at Amelia. You understand that I'm deciding something today. Yes. And you're not afraid of that. I'm afraid of it, she said. I'm choosing to be useful anyway. Something crossed Ferraro's face. She couldn't name it. It wasn't warmth. She didn't think Ferraro did warmth, not in rooms like this. But it was recognition. The particular recognition of someone who had spent decades reading people and had just read something that surprised them. He sat back. All right, he said. Tell me about Marco. They were in that room for 90 minutes. She had expected it to feel like being cross-examined. It did, and then it shifted, and after the first 30 minutes it felt less like a trial and more like a very intense job interview. The kind where the interviewer was genuinely trying to understand what they were looking at. Ferraro asked questions that seemed unrelated and weren't. He doubled back on things she'd said 20 minutes earlier to see if her answer would change. It didn't. She had told him the truth, and the truth stayed consistent. Dante spoke too. They moved between each other with the natural rhythm of two people who'd been paying attention to each other for years. And she caught Ferraro noticing that rhythm, clocking it as something real rather than performed. When they walked out of the private room, back through the kitchen, back into the side street, the air hit her, and she realized how tightly she'd been holding herself for 90 minutes. She exhaled slowly, precisely. In the car, Dante said nothing for a full minute. Then, you were extraordinary in there. I told the truth, she said. I know. That's what made it extraordinary. She looked at him. At his profile, the clean, angular line of his jaw, the slight tension still in his shoulders. What do you think he'll do? I think he'll pull Marco's access to Ferraro's network. Dante's voice was carefully controlled. I think he'll require a full accounting of how Marco has been managing communications between our organizations. He paused, which means Marco will know within 24 hours that the meeting happened and how it went. And then Marco moves. And then Marco moves. She thought about that. How bad? Bad. He looked at her. I need you to understand, not to frighten you, but because you said you wanted honesty, that Marco doesn't concede. He has never, in 11 years, accepted a situation that didn't go his way without responding to it. He will respond. What kind of response? Dante said, the kind that can't be unsaid. She absorbed that. The car moved through traffic. Outside, the city went about its day with complete indifference. When we get back to the estate, she said, I want a full security briefing. I want to know who's on the property, what the protocols are, and what our vulnerabilities are. She looked at him. Can you do that? Yes. Then let's start there. Jab. The security briefing took 2 hours. Dante walked her through it himself. The camera placements, the gate protocols, the 3-man overnight rotation, the communication system between the house and the 6 people in the wider organization he trusted completely. She asked questions and he answered them, and she noticed somewhere in the second hour that he was looking at her differently than he ever had. Not with the longing she'd caught before, with something that looked like partnership. She didn't say anything about it. They were eating dinner, late, almost 9 o'clock, because neither of them had thought about food until Rosa appeared in the doorway with the quiet insistence of a woman who had learned to maintain domestic structure in difficult circumstances. When Nico called, Dante answered, listened for 30 seconds, and set the phone down on the table. His face had changed. What? She said. Marco went to Ferraro first. Before our meeting, he'd already submitted a formal challenge. Yesterday. His voice was absolutely flat. Ferraro didn't tell us during the meeting. He let us come in without that information. To see how we'd perform without it. Yes. What kind of challenge? A formal request to have me removed from leadership of the Eastern Corridor and replaced. He paused. On the grounds of compromised judgment. He had it ready before today. This wasn't a response to the Paolo decision. He's been building this for months. Dante's jaw tightened. The Paolo situation was just the excuse. The reason, the real reason, is what we thought it was. Ferraro gave him an opening, and Marco used it. She looked at the food in front of her and wasn't hungry anymore. What does Ferraro do with the formal challenge? He has to act on it. It goes through a process. Dante picked up his phone and set it down again. He'll convene a meeting, our side and Marco's side, with Ferraro as the arbitrating authority. We make our case, Marco makes his, Ferraro decides. When? Nico says probably 48 hours. And in the meantime, Marco knows the meeting happened today and that it didn't go the way he wanted. Dante looked at her. He'll want to change the information available to Ferraro before the formal meeting, something that makes what happened today irrelevant. She understood what he wasn't saying. He'll come here. Not him personally. He's too careful for that. Then someone he sends. Dante said nothing, which was confirmation. She picked up her fork and made herself eat. Practical. Fuel. She needed to think clearly, and thinking clearly required a functioning body, and that required food, and this was not the moment to make dramatic gestures about not being hungry. Tell the overnight team to double, she said. And I want Rosa to stay in her room tonight. She doesn't need to be in hallways. Dante looked at her. You're not going to ask me to send you somewhere safer. No. Most people would. I'm not most people. She met his eyes. And this is my house too. Something in his face did what it had been doing increasingly. That shift, that movement. And she still didn't fully have a name for it, but she thought it might be the specific thing that happened when a person who had stopped expecting to be surprised found themselves surprised anyway. He made the calls. She cleared the table because Rosa had already been told to stay in her room, and the act of doing something physical and finite helped her think. She washed 2 plates and dried them and put them away and stood at the kitchen counter breathing steadily. The house was quiet. The doubled security team was in place. Dante was in the study making more calls, low and rapid, the specific cadence of a man pulling resources. She went upstairs. She didn't go to her room. She went to the small sitting room at the end of the second-floor hallway, the one with windows that looked out over the front gate and the driveway, and she sat in a chair where she could see the approach. She wasn't going to sleep. She sat with her hands loose in her lap and her eyes on the gate and the quiet street beyond it, and she thought about everything that had led to this chair in this window. Her father's letter on the kitchen table, the contract at 3 in the morning, Paolo, the broken glass in the corner of the meeting room, Nico's voice on the phone, careful and precise, handing her a grenade. She thought about Dante saying, "I looked into your father's circumstances, and I found you." And she thought about how that could be the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to her, and one of the most troubling at the same time. And she thought about how people were like that, how the things that made you love someone and the things that made you want to throw something at them were often exactly the same things, wearing different coats. She wasn't resolved. She wanted to be clear with herself about that. The anger was still there, metabolizing slowly. She hadn't forgiven him because you didn't forgive people on a deadline, and she wasn't going to perform resolution she hadn't actually reached. But she was sitting at his window watching his gate at 11 at night, and she was doing it freely, and that was its own kind of answer to a question she hadn't fully articulated yet. An hour passed. Dante appeared in the doorway of the sitting room. He had a jacket on over his shirt now, and he stood in the doorway and looked at her at the window. "You should rest," he said. "I know." "You're not going to." "No." He came and sat in the chair across from her. He didn't try to talk her into leaving. He just sat down with her and looked at the same window, the same dark driveway, and they were quiet together. 20 minutes passed. Then all the lights went out. Not a flicker. Not a gradual dimming. All of them, inside and outside, gone at once, leaving nothing but the faint ambient glow of the city sky beyond the walls. Dante was on his feet before she was. "Power cut," he said. His voice had changed completely. The quiet man at the window was gone. This was the other one. Deliberate. "Stay here." Dante. "Stay here?" He pulled something from inside his jacket. A phone, she realized, already calling, and moved to the door. "Don't leave this room until I come back for you." She heard him on the call. Short, fast, operational. And then his footsteps moving down the hallway, and then nothing. She stood in the dark sitting room and listened to the house. The quiet was wrong. There was a quality to it that she recognized from a different context, from the particular silence of a room where a serious conversation had just been ended and everyone was waiting for what came next. Held breath silence. About to break silence. She moved to the wall beside the door. Not in the doorway. Not visible from the hall. She put her back against the wall and stood very still and thought about every practical thing she knew about this floor. The layout, the exits, the distance to the main staircase, the door at the far end that led to the back stairs Rosa used. She heard the front door open. Not the alarm. The alarm was dead with the power. Just the sound of the front door, which she had learned over weeks, had a specific soft resistance when it opened because the weather stripping was slightly too thick on the bottom edge. She heard that resistance. She heard it release. And then she heard footsteps that weren't Dante's and weren't any of the security team she'd been introduced to over the past 2 hours, because she had learned to listen to this house the way she'd learned to listen to everything, carefully, completely, without telling herself she was doing it. These footsteps were careful. Placed. The footsteps of someone who knew where they were going. Her hands were cold. She pressed them flat against the wall behind her. She thought about the back stairs, 15 feet down the hall to her left. If she moved now, before whoever was on the main staircase reached the second floor, she could go down the back stairs and out through the kitchen, and she could be out of the house in 45 seconds. She thought about Dante somewhere in this dark house, moving toward the front while people moved in through it. She didn't move toward the back stairs. She looked around the dark room, and her eyes had adjusted enough now that she could see shapes, and she crossed to the bookshelf by the window and took down the heavy glass bookend, a solid block of it, the kind that weighed enough to matter, and she moved back to her position by the wall, and she waited. The footsteps reached the top of the main staircase. She could hear 2 sets now, moving separately, one toward her end of the hall, one in the other direction. The door to the sitting room opened. The man who came in was big. She registered that first. A shape in the darkness, wide shoulders, moving with the specific economy of someone trained. He swept the room visually, the way you swept a room when you expected it to be empty. He didn't look at the wall immediately to his right. She stepped out and hit him across the back of the skull with the bookend, and the sound it made was horrible. And she didn't stop to think about that. She just stepped back as he went down, and the sound of him hitting the floor was very loud in the dark, quiet house. Her hands were shaking. She registered that and set it aside. From somewhere below, she heard shouting, Dante's voice, and another voice, and then the specific crash of furniture, and then a sound she'd never heard in her life but recognized immediately from somewhere instinctive and animal, a gunshot. Her heart rate spiked so hard she felt it in her jaw. She moved, out the door, down the hall, not toward the back stairs, toward the main staircase, toward the sound, because something had overridden the rational calculation about exits and had replaced it with something blunt and non-negotiable that said, he's down there, and that was all it said. The second man stepped out of a doorway ahead of her, and she was moving too fast to stop, and they collided. She hit him with her shoulder, all her weight forward, and he grabbed her arm, and she went into the wall and felt the impact in her teeth, and his grip was on her wrist, and he was pulling her back, and she twisted, hard, the way that felt wrong, and wrenched at the shoulder socket, and she pulled free. She ran. The main staircase. Down. The foyer below was dark, and she was at the bottom, and she heard, to her left, the front sitting room. She heard a voice she recognized, Dante's, very controlled, saying, "That's enough." She went left. The front sitting room, 3 men in it that she could see, one of Dante's security on the floor. Not moving, but breathing. She could see the breathing. 2 men she didn't recognize, and Dante, who had his back to the fireplace and blood on his face from somewhere above his left eye, and the gun that one of the strangers had pointed at him from 6 feet away. All of it in the faint light that came through the windows. She stepped into the doorway and said, "Stop." Every head turned. The man with the gun looked at her. Amelia Russo, blazer disheveled, shoulder aching, standing in the doorway with a glass bookend in her hand and her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. "Amelia," Dante's voice was very quiet. "Get out of this room." "No." "I'm telling you, I heard you." She looked at the man with the gun. "I know who sent you." The man said nothing. "Marco Vitelli." She held his gaze. "He told you this would be clean and fast and that nobody would know the order came from him. He told you that removing Dante tonight would resolve the situation before the Ferraro meeting." She paused. "He didn't tell you that Ferraro has already seen what he's doing, that the challenge Marco filed has been reviewed, and that Ferraro's people are going to be in this house in approximately—" She stopped, made herself be still. "In approximately 15 minutes, because Nico Beretti made a call tonight when the power went out. And Nico's people are Ferraro's people." She didn't know if that last part was true. She was making a calculation based on what she knew of Nico's relationships, and she was doing it in a dark room with a gun pointed at the man she did not finish the thought. "Killing Dante tonight doesn't save Marco," she said. "It makes him the person who forced Ferraro's hand, and Ferraro does not like having his hand forced." She looked at the man steadily. "You have a very short window to walk out of this house and put significant distance between yourself and the order you were given tonight." The room was completely still. The gunman looked at Dante, back at Amelia, at the man on the floor, at the other man with him, who was also very still. 3 seconds, 5. The gun lowered. Not all the way. Just a half height, a posture that said not yet instead of now. Dante moved. He moved fast, faster than she'd ever seen a person move, crossing the room in 2 steps and taking the man's gun arm at the wrist, and the room erupted, crashing furniture, the other man grabbing and Dante blocking it, and she pressed herself into the doorframe, and the fight was short and brutal. And she forced herself to watch, because looking away was a luxury for people who weren't in this room. It lasted maybe 20 seconds. When it was over, both men were on the floor and Dante was standing, and his breathing was ragged, and the blood from the cut above his eye had tracked all the way down to his jaw. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You lied," he said, "about Nico calling Ferraro's people." "I made an educated inference," she said. "It worked." His chest was heaving. He pressed the back of his hand against his eyebrow, checking the blood. His eyes didn't leave her face. "You could have been shot," he said. "Yes. You walked into a room where someone had a gun pointed at me and you—" He stopped. "I know what I did." Amelia. Her name in his mouth sounded like something she didn't have a category for, like it had weight it hadn't had before, like saying it was an act that required something from him. From outside the house, and she could hear it clearly now, the sound of vehicles on the driveway. Headlights swept through the windows. Multiple cars. Moving fast. "That'll be Nico," Dante said. He hadn't looked away from her. "Then you should go deal with it." In a second. He crossed the room in 3 steps, and his hand came up to her face. Not gentle exactly, but careful, the way you were careful with something that mattered. And he tilted her chin slightly and looked at her in the faint light sweeping through the windows. "Are you hurt?" "My shoulder. I went into a wall upstairs. I'm fine." "You don't know if you're fine until—" "Dante." She put her hand over his, on her face, held it there. "Go deal with what's outside. I'll be here." He looked at her for one more moment. Then he went. She stood in the ruined sitting room with 2 unconscious men on the floor and one of Dante's security team starting to come around against the far wall, and she felt the shaking arrive. The delayed kind, the kind the body held off until the crisis passed. She let it come. She sat down on the arm of an overturned chair and let her hand shake and breathed through it and didn't try to make it stop. Outside voices, Nico's among them, the organized sound of people who knew what they were doing, taking charge of a situation. Inside, her, sitting in the dark, waiting for the shaking to run its course. She thought about Dante's hand on her face, about the way he'd said her name. She thought about all of it, the contract and the coffee maker, and the lies and the truths and the room she'd walked into tonight, with a glass bookend and her heart in her throat. And she thought, there is no version of this story where I am not already in love with him. She had known it for a while. She had been managing it, negotiating with it, keeping it at arm's length with the conditions and the boundaries and the careful architecture of not yet. The architecture was gone now. The wall was down. She was sitting in the rubble of it, and she was still shaking, and her shoulder hurt, and there was blood on the floor of the sitting room that might be Dante's, and she was more certain of that one fact than she had been of anything in a very long time. Outside, the voices resolved into organization. She waited. The shaking stopped after 11 minutes. She knew the exact duration because she had fixed her eyes on the clock on the mantelpiece, a small brass thing that had survived the fight without being knocked over, which struck her as faintly absurd, and she had watched the minute hand move while her hands did what they needed to do, and when they stopped, she took one long breath and stood up. The security team member against the far wall had regained consciousness. His name was Tomas. She had learned all their names during the briefing, and he was sitting up with his hand pressed to the back of his head, looking at the 2 men on the floor with the particular expression of someone recalibrating. "Can you stand?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." He was already trying. Slowly, she crossed to him and offered her arm, and he took it, not because he was weak, but because he was smart enough to accept help. She got him to a chair. "Stay there. There are people outside." "Mr. Moretti?" "He's outside. He's upright." She looked at him steadily. "You're going to be all right." She went to find Dante. Outside, the driveway had become something that looked like a staging area. 4 vehicles she didn't recognize. 8 men, maybe 10, she counted quickly, moving with the coordinated efficiency of people who had protocols for this. Nico was near the front gate talking to a man she'd never seen, and the conversation was rapid and low, and she didn't try to listen to it. Dante was standing at the edge of the light, apart from the activity. Someone had pressed a cloth against his eyebrow, and he was holding it there himself now, pressure applied with the automatic efficiency of a man who had done this before. He was watching his driveway get managed by Nico's people, and his face was the controlled processing face she had learned. The one that meant he was taking inventory of everything that had happened and calculating what it cost. She walked to him. He heard her coming and turned before she reached him, and his eyes went over her the way they had inside, checking, assessing, the specific quality of attention that was looking for damage. "Shoulder," he said. "It's fine." "You said that inside." "It's still fine." She stopped beside him, close, not quite touching. "Tomas is conscious. He's inside sitting down. He'll need a doctor." "Already called." She looked at the driveway, at the controlled, organized motion of it. "Nico's people work fast." "Nico's people are Ferraro's people," Dante said. A pause. "You were right, as it turns out. Nico did call. He called the moment the power cut happened." He lowered the cloth from his eyebrow, checked it, pressed it back. Ferraro had already decided, before any of this. He'd decided during the meeting this afternoon. He needed to see what happened tonight to confirm it. Confirm what? That Marco was willing to go this far. His voice was flat. "Ferraro has rules. He'll bend most of them, but there are two he doesn't touch. You don't move against a sitting leader without authorization, and you don't bring violence into a domestic space." He looked at the house behind them. "Marco broke both tonight." "Where is Marco now?" "Nico's people picked him up 40 minutes ago." A pause. "He won't be a problem." She understood what that meant and didn't ask him to be more specific. Some things she was still learning to hold without flinching, and the knowing was enough. "Ferraro wants to meet again," Dante said. "Tomorrow morning, early." "With me?" "With both of us." He looked at her. He was specific about that. She nodded. They stood for a moment in the noise and motion of everything being handled, and she was aware of the specific quality of standing next to him, the solidity of it, physical and otherwise. And she was aware that she was tired in a way that went past the physical and into something structural. The kind of tired that meant you had used yourself fully and would need time to fill back up. "Amelia." His voice had changed, gone from operational to something that didn't have armor in it. "What you did tonight, in that room, coming down those stairs when you heard the shot, don't. I need to say it." "Then say it quickly," she said, "because I'm about to fall asleep standing up and I'd like to do it somewhere horizontal." Something crossed his face, the complicated thing. She was starting to understand it better. It was what happened when he felt something he hadn't budgeted for. "You scared me more than anything that has happened in this house tonight, and a great deal happened tonight. I know. I need you to understand that if something had—" He stopped. The professional flatness had completely left his voice, which was a thing she had never heard before in 5 years plus weeks. "I don't have language for what that would have been." She looked at him, at the blood tracking down to his jaw again because he'd lowered the cloth. She reached up and took it from his hand and pressed it back against the cut herself, and he went very still. "I know," she said again, quietly this time. "I was scared too. I did it anyway." "Why?" "Because you were in there." She held his gaze. "I already told you why." He looked at her with the cloth under her hand and the driveway full of noise behind them, and she felt the moment shift the way moments shifted when something that had been approaching for a long time finally arrived. "We have a lot to still work through," she said. "I know. The Reyes situation, the things you didn't tell me, I'm not—" She paused, chose words carefully. "I'm not pretending those are resolved. They're not. I know that too. But I'm here," she said. "That's what I've got for tonight." He put his free hand over hers, the one holding the cloth to his eyebrow, and just held it there. Not a gesture with intention in it, just contact, just warmth. "That's enough," he said. "That's more than enough." The doctor arrived at midnight. He was brisk and efficient, a man named Carver, who had clearly been to this house before, under similar circumstances, and had the particular professional equanimity of someone who had stopped being surprised by the wounds that arrived in the middle of the night. He stitched Dante's eyebrow. 4 stitches, Dante took them without sound, and he looked at Amelia's shoulder, which had begun to stiffen badly, and told her she had a mild separation that needed rest and ice and would ache for 2 weeks. "I don't have 2 weeks," she said. "You have the physiology you have," Dr. Carver said mildly. "Take it up with your shoulder." He left. Rosa, who had come downstairs when the cars arrived despite being told to stay up, was moving quietly through the ground floor with the specific focused energy of a woman who managed distress by cleaning. Amelia watched her for a moment and felt, unexpectedly, a rush of something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite affection, but was somewhere between both. "Rosa," she said. Rosa stopped. "Go to bed? Leave all of it? The floor in the sitting room will still be there in the morning. Go." Rosa looked at her. Then she set down the cloth in her hand and said, "Good night, Mrs. Moretti," and went upstairs with the dignity of a woman who had decided to accept the instruction. Amelia stood in the hallway alone for a moment. The house was quieting. Nico's people had cleared the driveway. The men from inside were gone, taken somewhere she didn't ask about. Tomas had been driven to a private medical facility. The house was her and Dante and Rosa, and the particular hum of a space that had been through something and was now processing it. She went upstairs. She didn't go to her room. She stopped in the hallway outside Dante's study. The light was on under the door, which meant he was in there despite the hour, which she had expected, and she knocked once and went in without waiting. He was at his desk. He had a glass of something in front of him that he hadn't touched. He looked up when she came in. "You should be sleeping," he said. "I'll sleep when I'm done." She came and sat in the chair across from his desk, not at the side of it, the way she'd sat in meetings for 5 years, but directly across, eye to eye. "Tell me about Callum Reyes, the full version, not what you gave me before." He looked at her for a moment, then he sat back. "Reyes worked for me for 6 years," he said. He was good at his job, which was introductions, connecting people who needed resources with resources that were available, legal in the technical sense, gray in the practical one. He turned the glass on his desk without picking it up. "About 5 years ago, I started noticing that his introductions weren't always balanced. He was finding people who were desperate, specifically desperate, people whose judgment was compromised by the desperation, and he was steering them toward terms that were advantageous to him. Kickbacks. He was taking money from both sides. Did you know when he approached my father? No. I knew Reyes was becoming a problem, but I didn't have specifics yet. By the time my review identified your father's loan as one of Reyes's introductions, you had been working for me for over a year and your father had been paying, slowly but paying. So you reviewed the loan and recognized my father's name. Yes. She absorbed that. And you said nothing to me. What would I have said? His voice was level but not cold, honest in the way things were when they were uncomfortable. Your father had borrowed the money freely. The terms were recorded. He was meeting them as best he could. Telling you would have... He stopped. I told myself telling you would have caused harm without purpose. I'm aware that wasn't entirely the reason. What was the other reason? I didn't want you to leave. He said it without decoration, just the fact. You were already there. By that point, you were the reason I didn't find reasons to avoid my own office. I told myself I was protecting you from information that would upset you. I was also protecting myself. His eyes held hers. That was wrong. It was the kind of wrong that compounds because it doesn't announce itself. It just becomes part of the foundation you're both standing on, and you can't pull it out without destabilizing everything. And the marriage contract, using the debt as the opening. Also wrong, differently wrong, but wrong. He put his hands flat on the desk. I have spent 40 years in a world where leverage is the primary language. You have a problem, you find the point of pressure that solves it. I applied that framework to something it had no business touching. He looked at her. I knew it was wrong when I did it. I did it anyway because I was afraid if I simply asked you, you would say no, and I would have no mechanism to make you reconsider. Dante. I know. You cannot build love on a mechanism. She leaned forward slightly. You understand that, right? Not because it's wrong in principle, though it is, but because it doesn't work. You can build compliance on a mechanism. You can build proximity. But not this. She paused. Not whatever this is. I understand that now. He looked at her. I'm not sure I fully understood it before you made me understand it. By arguing with you constantly. By being exactly who you are. consistently, without adjusting for my comfort. Something in his face softened. Not went soft, but released slightly, like a fist unclenching. No one has ever done that. In my entire adult life, the people around me have adjusted. They've calibrated to what I needed, or what they thought I needed, or what served them best. You never did. You're my boss. Were my boss, she paused. I didn't calibrate to you because I was too busy doing the job. I know. That's what made it... He stopped. Made it what? He was quiet for a moment. The first time you told me my office layout was inefficient, I went home and I laughed. Genuinely laughed, alone, which I hadn't done in a long time. He looked at the glass he still hadn't touched. I didn't know what to do with someone who told me the truth, because the truth was useful, not because they were trying to get something from me. She looked at him across the desk, at the stitches above his eye, at the hands flat on the surface between them. I'm angry with you, she said. I want to be clear about that. What you withheld, the way the contract was structured, the mechanism, I'm still angry. That doesn't resolve because of last night. I know. But I've thought about what anger is for, she said. Anger is information. It tells you something was wrong, and it tells you to pay attention, and it keeps you honest while you figure out what to do next. She held his gaze. It's not a conclusion. It's not a verdict. It's data. He was very still. So here's what I know, she said. I know you made wrong decisions. I know some of them came from a world that taught you that leverage was the only reliable currency and that you haven't fully unlearned that yet. I know you cut Reyes loose when you saw what he actually was. I know you restructured Paolo's debt when I asked you to. I know you put a coffee maker in my room without being asked, and that you remember I skipped meals and that for 5 years you listened to me more carefully than anyone in my life has ever listened to me. She paused. I know you walked into a burning house to reach me tonight. Not burning, he said carefully. You know what I mean. His jaw worked. I'm not saying the account is balanced, she said. I'm saying I can see the whole ledger, not just the entries that make you look bad. She looked at him steadily. That's new for me. I'm usually better at the bad entries. Amelia, his voice was rough. What are you saying? She stood up. She moved around the desk, and she stopped in front of him, and she put her hand on his face, the uninjured side, the way he had put his hand on hers outside in the driveway. Just contact, just the warmth of it. I'm saying I'm here, she said, and I'm not here because of a contract. I burned past the contract a while ago. She held his gaze. I'm here because I looked at everything, the whole of it, the bad and the real and the complicated, and I chose to be here. She paused. Don't give me a reason to unchoose it. He reached up and covered her hand with his. His eyes were closed for a moment, just a moment, the kind that contained something being felt at full volume. And then he opened them and looked at her. I won't, he said. She believed him. Not blindly. She had no capacity for blind belief and wouldn't have offered it to him as a gift even if she had. She believed him the way you believed a structure that had been tested. The things about Dante Moretti that were true had been proven under pressure. That was more than most people got. She dropped her hand. Get some sleep, she said. We have Ferraro in the morning. Amelia. She was at the door. Thank you, he said. For tonight. For... He stopped. For all of it. She looked at him over her shoulder. Don't thank me yet, she said. You still have a lot to answer for. But she was almost smiling when she said it. Chat. The Ferraro meeting lasted 45 minutes. It was, compared to what had preceded it, almost quiet. Ferraro was at the same table, the same water, the same watchful economy of a man who wasted nothing. He looked at them both when they sat down, Dante with stitches above his eye, and Amelia with her shoulder held slightly careful, and something in his face acknowledged what the night had cost without requiring it to be stated. Marco Vitelli will not be returning to any organizational function, Ferraro said. That's settled. Dante nodded. The challenge he filed is withdrawn, retroactively, which is an unusual step, but the circumstances warrant it. Ferraro's eyes moved to Amelia. He entered a domestic residence with the intention of violence. That is not something I will accommodate in any account of events. Understood, Dante said. The eastern corridor remains yours. Ferraro picked up his water glass. There will be a review in 6 months. Standard process. He looked at Amelia again, with that same quality of attention she'd felt the day before, the assessment of a man reading something he found genuinely interesting. Mrs. Moretti, what you said yesterday about policy and loyalty. Yes. I've been thinking about it since you said it. He set the glass down. You were correct. It's not a comfortable thing to be correct about at my age, after the policies I've maintained, but you were correct. A pause. I'd like to think about how that changes going forward. I'm glad to have that conversation, she said. Not today. He stood, which meant the meeting was over. In 6 months, at the review. He looked at Dante. Keep her. I intend to, Dante said. Ferraro walked out. They were in the car before Amelia said anything. He's going to be an interesting person to know, she said. He's going to be a complicated person to know. Those aren't mutually exclusive. She looked at the city moving past the window. He's going to hold you to a higher standard now, you understand that? Yes. And he's going to hold me to one too. That comment about keeping me, that wasn't a compliment, it was a notation. I know what it was. So do I. She was quiet for a moment. I'm not going to let that shape what I do, but I'm aware of it. Good. He looked at her profile. Amelia. What? When this is over, when we've gotten through the next weeks and things have settled into whatever shape they're going to settle into, I want to ask you something. She turned to look at him. Ask me now. He was quiet for a moment. The city passed around them. I want to ask you to marry me again. She held his gaze. Not as a contract, he said. Not as a resolution to anything. No debt, no mechanism, no leverage. Just, I want to ask you if you'll choose this. If you'll choose me. His voice was steady, but something underneath it was not. I know it's not the right moment. I know there's still work to do. I know you're still angry, and that's legitimate, and I'm not trying to move past that. He stopped. I wanted you to know that's coming, so you can decide what you think of it before it arrives. She looked at him for a long moment. I appreciate the notice, she said. That's not an answer. I know. She turned back to the window. I'm working on it. He said nothing more. The car moved through the city, and the silence between them was the good kind. The kind that had been earned, that didn't need to be filled. 3 months later, the garden behind the estate was unremarkable in the way that mattered most. It looked like itself, not like an event venue, not decorated into something it wasn't. Rosa had put flowers in simple arrangements at the corners of the small area they'd chosen, and the light in the late afternoon had the quality it always had in that garden, warm, slightly gold, the specific light of a day declining without drama. There were 9 people present, Nico and his wife, Dr. Carver, who had been surprised to receive the invitation and had come in a suit that was slightly too formal for the occasion and had been better for it, Rosa, who was standing very straight with her hands clasped in front of her and was not crying but was also not crying. A few others from Dante's inner circle, the ones who had been there through the various fires and had earned the right to see what came after. Clara had flown in from across the country. She was standing next to Amelia as the small gathering arranged itself, and she looked at Amelia in the dress she'd chosen herself, simple, dark blue, nothing that didn't feel like her, and said, "You're sure?" "I've been sure for a while," Amelia said. "I was just being careful about the timing. That's very you." "Yes, it is." Clara squeezed her hand once. "He's good?" Amelia looked across the garden to where Dante was standing, talking to Nico in the low, unhurried way of 2 people who had been through enough together to not need performance. He had a glass of something he wasn't drinking. He was wearing a dark jacket and no tie, which was as close as he got to casual, and there was still a faint trace of the scar above his left eye from the stitches, which had healed slightly uneven. "He's trying to be," Amelia said, "which is better than good, actually. Good is static. Trying is a practice." Clara looked at her. "That's either very wise or very practical." With me, it's usually the same thing. There was no officiant. There was no ceremony in the traditional architecture of one. What there was, Dante walking toward her across the garden in the afternoon light, and her walking toward him, and them meeting in the middle the way they'd been doing for months. Not perfectly, not without friction, but honestly, with eyes open. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her for years, except now she let herself see it. Now she didn't manage her response to it. She stood in the garden with the people who mattered, and she let herself be looked at and looked back. "You ready?" he said. "I've been ready," she said. "You're the one who asked for notice." That got a real smile from him. Unguarded, quick, the one she'd learned was rare and therefore worth more than the performed ones. "I wanted to make sure you actually chose this. I chose this the night I signed the contract at 3 in the morning," she said. "I was just mad about the circumstances for a while." "You had every right to be." "I know." She reached up and touched the scar above his eye, briefly, just the tips of her fingers. "Don't give me new reasons." "I'll do my best. That's all I'm asking." They stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cooling afternoon, and Rosa was definitely crying now from across the garden, and Clara was doing the thing where she pressed her lips together so she wouldn't make noise, and Nico was looking at the sky with the studied neutrality of a man pretending not to be moved. She thought about her father, about a man who had made a bad decision from a place of desperation and love, trying to protect what he had without asking for help. She thought about the fact that he had died not knowing how it would unfold, that the debt and the name Moretti would become something other than a tragedy. She thought about sitting at his kitchen table with the letter in her hands and believing that was the end of a story. It had been the beginning of one. She thought about 5 years of Monday mornings and the lamp in the corner and the coffee maker and the way the truth came out in layers. And she thought about the sitting room at 3 in the morning 3 months ago with her hands shaking and the man she loved standing in the dark. She thought, he spent years watching me from a distance because he didn't know how to say the thing without ruining it. She thought, I spent years watching him from a distance for exactly the same reason. They had both been wrong about the method. They had not been wrong about the thing itself. "Amelia Russo," Dante said. His voice was very quiet. The people in the garden could probably not hear him. That was deliberate. "Dante Moretti," she said. "I'm asking you again." "I know you are." "Will you—" "Yes," she said. He stopped. "You didn't let me finish," he said. "You've been working up to it for 5 years." She held his gaze. "Yes, now finish." Something moved through his face, all of it at once. The things he usually kept managed, the things she had slowly learned to read. She thought she saw relief again, the way she'd seen it the morning she brought back the signed contract, except this time it was larger and had more territory in it. He said, "Will you stay? Not because of anything except that you want to." "Yes," she said again. "That's why." He reached out and took her hand, not the formal way, not the careful way, just the way one person took another person's hand when they were standing next to them, and it was the obvious thing to do. She let him. She held back. Behind them, Clara laughed, and it was the real laugh, the one that meant she'd lost the fight against her own feelings. And Rosa said something under her breath that was probably in another language and was probably not suitable for public record. And Nico looked at the sky for another moment before giving up and looking at them. Dante and Amelia stood in the garden with their hands together and the afternoon light going gold around them. And it was not romantic in the movie way. There were no vows composed in beautiful language, no music, no arch of flowers. It was just two people who had been honest with each other about the worst of themselves and had decided to stay anyway, which was the harder kind of love and the kind that lasted. The evening came in slowly. Rosa went to the kitchen. Clara poured something for everyone. Nico told a story that was probably not entirely true but was very funny, and Dante stood next to Amelia at the edge of the gathering with their shoulders touching and said nothing, which was enough. There was still work to do. She knew that. The 6-month review with Ferraro, which would require her to be exactly who she was, in a room full of people who were still calibrating what she meant in this world. The longer conversation with Dante about Reyes and the 5 years of knowing and the choices made in that time, They had started it and would keep starting it in pieces until the shape of it was fully held between them. The medical center he had offered her and that she had not yet answered about, because some things needed to be decided when there was space around them and not in the middle of fires. She knew all of it was still coming. She was not afraid of it. She had walked into Ferraro's private room with a clear head and a steady voice. She had stood in a dark sitting room with a glass bookend and made a calculation that worked. She had sat at her father's kitchen table at 3 a.m. and signed her name to something she didn't fully understand, and that had turned out to be the beginning of the most complicated and honest and real thing that had ever happened to her. She was the woman who had spent 5 years as a secretary, careful and competent and contained, telling herself she wasn't paying attention to the man across the desk. She was the woman who had been angry enough to shake and clear-eyed enough to stay. She was the woman who had chosen this. Not because it was easy, not because the foundation wasn't cracked in places she was still learning, not because the world they were navigating was anything other than dangerous and imperfect and demanding of everything she had. She had chosen it because the man beside her was trying, because trying, sustained and honest, was the closest thing to proof that a person could give, because she had looked at all of it, the bad decisions and the real feelings and the lamp in the corner and the blood on the sitting room floor. And she had decided that imperfect and honest was worth more than perfect and safe. Dante said, "You're thinking." "I'm always thinking." "What about?" She looked at him. "That I'm glad I signed the contract," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Even given everything, because of everything." She turned back to the garden, to Clara laughing at something Nico had said, and Rosa carrying a tray with the exact posture of a woman who considered domestic grace to be its own form of resistance. "The contract got me in the door. Everything after is ours." He was quiet. Then, "Ours." "Ours," she said. "Get used to it." The last light went out of the garden slowly, the way good things ended, without hurry, without drama, leaving something behind it that would be there in the morning. She stayed until it was gone, and then she went inside.